All right. Welcome, everyone. I hope that you're having a beautiful day, a nice week. If it's anything like Toledo, Ohio, February has brought the full force of like single digit temperatures. Chris, you're in Southern Virginia. What's temperatures like there?
Today we had a significant relative to what we typically experience in terms of snowfall. We had a little light snowfall this morning.
Oh, man. Was school canceled?
School was not canceled. No, no, no. The town stayed open. The bus transit system remained open, and the students did get to school safely.
Nice. All right. Well, for those of you that are joining us, welcome. I'm super excited tonight. I have absolutely one of my most favorite human beings on the face of the planet, Chris Sanchez. Chris is the executive director, and that doesn't do him enough justice as a human being and as his role of what he's doing at the Christiansburg Institute. And I'll give you a second here in a few moments, Chris, to kind of tell us a little bit more about that. I do want to say this is a time for you to be able to ask questions, interact with us. Chris is so gracious to be here and be willing to interact with our audience. But if you do have a question, throw it in the chat, put a Q and a colon. It makes it a little bit easier for me to find in the midst of the stream. And we just ask that you're kind, generous, and compassionate to each other, but no questions are censored. So with that being said, Chris, do you want to just kind of give us a quick synopsis of what you do and who you are? And I don't know that you can actually wrap up in a quick synopsis, not because you're not concise, but because you are so many things. So, but if you could share with us a little bit about Christiansburg Institute and a little bit about yourself, I'd be super grateful.
I would love to, and you honor me this evening. I'm really excited to be on the podcast with Don. In terms of what I do, I've lived in Southwest Virginia now for about 11 years. My wife and I, Chelsea, live here in Christiansburg in Montgomery County. And I had moved here about 10 years ago to be a part of a church planting launch team, uh, at that time, Dust Covenant in
Yep.
church, and came this way, Southwest Virginia, to plant a church in Blacksburg, and that's kind of what initially brought me to this area. And then try to fast forward a decade later, and I discovered this incredible story of local African American history that I had previously been entirely unaware of. And that's the 100-year story of the Christiansburg Institute. It is extraordinarily challenging to summarize such a tremendous history, one that is daily being researched and preserved here in Southwest Virginia. But the Christiansburg Institute was the first secondary African American high school in the region of Southwest Virginia to educate the formerly enslaved. And the school was established in 1866 and lasted a century until 1966. And today, fast forward to 2023, I have the privilege and honor of being the executive director of a nonprofit committed to the preservation of the one of the last remaining buildings that constituted the former Christiansburg Institute campus, and that would be the Edgar A. Long building, and then also to share the story through our educational nonprofit mission of CI and then local African American history in rural Appalachia here in Southwest Virginia. So, briefly, this is some of what I get to do, and I love what I do. And we have an extraordinary team at the Christiansburg Institute, and there's a strong community in Montgomery County and Pulaski County and the city of Radford and in the region that really believes in the story and witnessed it. And so, we love to celebrate that story, and I have the privilege and honor of serving as executive director.
That's awesome. And I think kind of to give some even texture a little bit about
Mm,
what that space is like in that part of Virginia today. you're only a couple hours away from Charlottesville, which was obviously the center of the national news just a few years ago, when it came to a march and a rally by white supremacists and the murder of one of the protesters, or the counter protesters, I guess it would be said, which actually in some ways ties back to where I am here in Toledo, because the person that actually drove the vehicle through the crowd had lived here in one of the suburbs of Toledo. And so I know you were at Charlottesville on that day. And it's a strange temperature in that part of the country. Honestly, in every part of the country, but Virginia particularly has some unique things that it faces.
Absolutely. I think this is true of United States history, right? Generally, as we are challenging narratives about what happened in the United States, even pre-slavery, of course. It's interesting. The first thing I would say, too, I was not at the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. Okay, so I don't remember the exact date on the calendar. However, I was in Charlottesville 1 month prior, and one
I
month
see.
prior to, right, and so 1 month prior to the kind of very large demonstration of white supremacy and neo-Nazis and hate groups in abundance in Charlottesville. A month prior, myself and a group of folks from the Montgomery County area went to Charlottesville, and that was to protest the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. And that was sort of that demonstration by the Klan was sort of like a tester to see what the public response would be, what government response would be.
All right. Well, we lost Chris for a moment, but he should be right back in just a moment. So give us 1 second here. Hopefully Chris can log back in. There we go. Sorry about that, Chris.
That's okay. What was the last thing you heard me say, Don?
That it was a testing ground for the
Right.
KKK and
Yep.
white supremacy.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and so there was a lot of people at the Klan demonstration, counter protesting. I think there was less than 100 actual Klans people and several hundred folks, demonstrating against that smaller minority group. Obviously, we saw what happened a month later. There was
Right.
a much larger response and a much larger presence. Um, I think the interesting thing about Virginia, among the many things that are interesting about Virginia, is that a lot of what really kind of laid the foreground for slavery and human trafficking kind of was in the Commonwealth. And I think that's a part of our United States history that we need to be able to kind of examine honestly, and then sort of share a broader story about what that really looked like in real
Right.
places in the Commonwealth. And I think that's why it's important that Christiansburg Institute can kind of provide a rich narrative of what is Virginia, right? So, I grew up on the West Coast. I grew up in Oregon, right? And then moved to the Metro Detroit area. And so being a Yankee and being from the North and, being black, when you had asked me, of course, to consider moving to Virginia to be discipled and to help with the church, all kinds of preconceived notions about moving to the South. And, obviously, Virginia is certainly not the Deep South. It is indeed the South, but it is not the Deep South, and it's unique in its Southwest Appalachian location. And I say that because it's more than just slavery, and it's more than just what we think about when we think about the South, right?
Right.
There are a strong rich history and tradition of Black people in education that is self-determined, that I think needs to be presented in a healthy balance, so we can have a fuller understanding about who we are, and of course, where we might be able to think about where we're going.
So, Chris, I know a lot of what you spend your time and day doing is truth telling, and I love that that is kind of how you present who you are as a truth teller, and it's so accurate to who I know you to be. I'm just curious if you have tonight. My Cleveland Cavaliers are playing the Memphis
Mm,
Grizzlies, and Memphis has recently been the home of one of the most gruesome, terrible things that have happened. And I think it's 5 officers were convicted this past week, found guilty of murder. And I know that you and I had chatted a little bit earlier today and kind of talked briefly about this, but tell us a little bit about kind of where your advocacy, your truth telling, and these types that are happening way too often, these types of stories meet.
yeah, I think that's wow. What a really important question. I think truth telling is something that we're constantly pursuing, and there's a lot of action involved in that, and there's a lot of self-reflection and integrity involved in that. To kind of contextualize, I think maybe to help share kind of where my advocacy work intersects with truth telling. The killing of Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin, these things happened sort of in the earlier parts of when we were church planting. And so
Yes.
there was a larger conversation happening in the American public about the relationship of race and law enforcement in history in the country. And I recall being very distraught and confused as to why the evangelical Christian church was largely silent,
Mm.
and that began to blur some of the lines of faith and theology and social advocacy work and that intersection. And of course, at that time, as a church, we were working through The Cross and the Lynching Tree,
Yes.
written by the late and great Dr. James Cone. And we read that as a church community. And that was one of the first, no, I'm sorry, that was absolutely the first book that provided an alternative understanding and an alternative perspective, an alternative interpretation that was not predominantly European. There's really no other way to say that. I'm sure we could nuance that more, but
I don't think there's a
um,
need to.
for now, indeed. So James Cone and his extraordinary body of work, of course, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, Black Theology, Black Power, really challenged my notions of what my commitment was at that time as a Christian to undoing oppression in the United States. And what does that mean if the root of oppression has historically dominated non-white nations? And in our context here, we see, as we talk about African American history and Black History Month, the continent of Africa. And so that process and that journey caused me to internally challenge truths that I held close to me, and that is what is required in order to be able to turn and share that truth. There's a real process, spiritual, emotional, intellectual process, I think, that goes along in that journey. And to continue to honor Dr. James Cone, I actually emailed the good brother, the elder. I emailed him. I had my first teaching, my first sermon at the church at that time. I don't know the year. I know it's 2023. I don't know the. This was
It's all a blur.
uh, 7 years ago, 6 years ago. and I was going to be, broadly speaking, going to be talking about the intersections of race and theology and faith. And I had emailed Dr. James Cohn, who at that time was still alive, and he was teaching at Union. I think that's
I think that's
correct.
right. That sounds right. Yeah.
That's correct. And he got back to me, and what I had emailed him saying was, I'm nervous. I'm nervous to talk about these weighty truths
Yeah.
and at that time, predominantly white church community. So how do I do this with integrity and with courage? And he got back to me and he said, you just do it without fear,
Yeah.
and you have to be committed to truth telling. And so that's been an imprint on my thinking and on how I move and how I think about challenging subjects that kind of require some of that integrity and that courage to really kind of push through um, um, the veil and really challenge.
Chris, you bring up something I think that's interesting and might be interesting / compelling to some of the folks watching or listening. Is the church that you were going to be speaking at was the church that you and I planted in Blacksburg and Dust
Mm-hmm.
Church, and it was predominantly white, but it was a very left-leaning, progressive, activist-minded church. Yet there was still fear for you. And I think that's so important because I think sometimes, particularly within white progressive movements, there is a confusion that that everything's okay now, and that there is a bit of a, I don't know, maybe it's again white privilege of a mindset that does not recognize that a person such as yourself, a young black man, younger at the time, not that much younger though, but younger at the time, speaking in front of basically a white congregation that was open to the discussion, still created fear, anxiety, and concern. Is there anything you'd want to say? Because most of the listeners and most of the people that are going to tune into this would identify as more left leaning, more liberal, would even probably consider themselves to be progressive. What do you, what kind of things would you want white churches in those settings to still understand about the danger they represent, or at least the concern they create in these moments?
I think mic drop. Uh, big question. I think the church, in particular, of course, the white church, needs to continue to take steps to turn and to take steps in a straight direction when we think about its direct relationship to and cause of a lot of racialized violence. Again, we can go across the world, but we'll keep it to the United States and we'll keep it to North America. I think these are important truths that young people who are black, who are BIPOC, who are black, who are brown, who are people of color, who know that this history is extraordinarily contested. And I think that we have to accept that. I think we have to encourage that. I think we have to help people ask, as I'm sure you might agree, ask better questions. I'm the son of a pastor, right? And having been adopted into a multiracial family, grew up in oftentimes only predominantly white church settings. Uh, and the struggle is certainly not over.
Right.
But attending church service on Sunday, I probably or Sunday school or Bible camp, growing up as a young adult and as an adolescent, I probably wouldn't have known that. A lot of what we were focusing on was spiritual disciplines, which are important. There's a place for that, and that's important. but there was a large absence of the the praxis, the application, the action of those spiritual disciplines and principles. So, yeah, I think we have to be more honest and more truthful, and we have to be able to have the courage and the confidence to challenge power, and that's not easy to do. That's not
No,
easy to do, but you do that by
especially when
study,
you
and you
don't
do that by
have to,
go ahead.
right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The white community doesn't have to challenge power because they're comfortable in the seat they sit. And I think some of the danger that progressive white individuals, white Christians particularly, face is that they don't need to continue to challenge the power because they're it like there seems to be a level at which, okay, things have changed, or at least in my circle, I now use proper language.
Mhm,
I've changed the way I speak. I now have friends who are of color that I can claim as
mhm,
being more than an acquaintance. And so I have in some ways done my job. And I
mhm.
think it's really easy for white folks in the progressive movement, liberal movement, whatever you want to call it. I hate all those terms, but you get what I'm saying.
Mhm,
That
mhm.
it's easy for them to take their foot off the gas and be like, okay, the attention has been drawn, the changes are happening, and we're good.
I think that's something that's observable, and I think uh, the murder of Tyree Nichols, for example, is one of those visceral racial incidents of violence that seems though to shock the Americans' public's gaze and consciousness to go, oh wow, maybe this is still in fact a problem. And earlier when we were thinking about Charlottesville, I mean, there was hundreds and hundreds of white supremacists bearing arms in public, right? But and so we need to acknowledge that, and then we need to say it cannot only be these incidents that are very public and become very visible that cause us to go, oh wow, we need to really go, whoa, what's going on? Oh man, there's still people who are racist, and people still use the N word, and oh wow, like absolutely. I have the tremendous privilege of working with young people. It's one of my favorite things to do is work with high school students. And we offer an internship program to high school students, and two of our students shared about their experience being black and today, right, of course today, like 2022 at that time, and being called the n-word,
Yeah.
and it's 2022, and I experienced this when I was, in third grade, and I get to talk to elders who of course experienced it when they were our age as well. So it's there. It's just, do we want to have the courage again to talk about it, because it does require courage, and it's not just the courage of the truth teller. It's the courage of the audience, of the
Yeah.
those who are being challenged to make the decision, to assume a posture of, maybe I need to re-examine my power and its direct impact on the oppression of marginalized people. And I think that's where we see people lose. I think that's where we see people not want to make those decisions, because it directly benefits their power.
Yeah. I feel like in some ways, even Black History Month creates a little bit of this complication, particularly within white minds, of, how do we talk about Black History Month? I'm a part of, so I have a side gig with an organization. I do some of their marketing, and there was a discussion about, hey, should we make a post since it's Black History Month, right? And it's interesting because one of the parts that were brought up was, well, what's within character of the organization? Would it be
Mm,
out of character to post something? Would it be within character to post something? What would that be like? What would that look like? And at what point, especially since this particular organization is really a mixture across the spectrum of politics, which, then you get into the derogatory term of being woke and other things, right? Which is so fascinating since that term did not begin as a derogatory term.
No,
And
no, no, no.
and so I think that this again is another one of those pieces that creates complications within the white evangelical particular, or the white Christian mind, and it freezes people. And they don't know, an individual doesn't know, how do I talk about Black History Month in a manner that doesn't tokenize? How do I talk about Black History Month in a manner that doesn't seem trite? How do I speak about Black History Month in a manner that actually adds value to discourse and beauty to the community that it is being presented to? And I think that there's a huge learning curve that still is needed for a lot of folks. But again, I think that there's a fear of getting it wrong. And the fear of getting it wrong will almost always, no matter who you are, will cause you some level of paralyzation. Right.
True.
So I'm just curious what you think, what some of your thoughts are as that, because even here, as you can imagine, Chris, most of the audience that checks in on AJFF is going to be white evangelicalism. That's who's primarily doing deconstruction at this point, because African-American churches, Black churches across the U.S. have been studying and reading James Cone and using liberation theology their entire lives. And so much of what white evangelicalism is deconstructing too is what a lot of African-American churches have been preaching every Sunday for the last 50, 60 years.
I think, first of all, Black History Month is 1 month, right? And I think there's a lot of jokes, right, around like, oh, Black History Month should be like all year, and like,
Right.
why does Black History Month have 1 month? And
And
then
the
there's like
shortest
the
month.
counter, right, right, and then there's the counter, clearly racist response, which is like, well, why isn't there a White History Month or something
Right.
to that effect? Um, and working in a nonprofit setting where we're committed to the preservation of African American history and stories every day, we're the first to be like, that's absolutely true. We need to be talking about Black history and Black stories, not just every day, but we need to get it into our standards of learning in our public
Yes.
schools, because there's a lot of students who do not know about Black history, period. And because Black history, of course, is not just like one thing only. If we think about the Reconstruction era in the South, this is post Civil War, right there in 1866. The next 20 years, we see an extraordinary increase in Black leadership in terms of taking elected office. And that is repressed immediately by uh, uh, white supremacy and the movement of the Klan. But we don't really even know that history. It's not really taught.
No.
And so I think yeah, right. And so I think we need to advocate for the telling of Black history daily. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't have Black History Month. That's whatever. I think Black History Month is a month that we have, and we'll celebrate Black history during that month. And we can also advocate for the telling of African American history and stories, throughout the calendar year. Um, you know, I think, earlier, and you just again, Dr. James Cone. We also need to completely deconstruct the programming that we've received in public schools and in our churches about who the brother Reverend Martin Luther King was and what he represented.
Yes.
Um, Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., has been extraordinarily sanitized. And when I say that, we talk about that theologically, sure. But this brother advocated economics. This
Yeah.
brother was very keyed in on economic impact and disparity for Black people everywhere, but of course, in particular in the South, and was also very vocal about being anti-war, and this was a reverend. This was a reverend.
Yep.
And when we think about the civil rights movement and we think about the 60s, we often think about the extraordinary, powerful speeches of preachers, Black preachers, and we need to always honor and remember that. But we also need to think about where their theology took them
Mm.
into their communities. Operation Breadbasket, this was done at the leadership of Dr. King, and this was to boycott stores that simply would not employ Black people. And this was to not buy products, and this had a massive economic impact on these, of course, white-owned businesses. And this was something in addition to marching
Yes.
and preaching the text that made some progress possible. And I don't mean to diminish the progress that has been made, but we must recognize there, of course, is an extraordinary amount of progress for us to continue to strive towards.
Yeah, Amanda had commented while you were talking that want to not be performative. And I think that this is such an interesting thing, right? This performativeness that exists within whiteness during African American History Month, or Latino History Month, whatever history month we're speaking of, is that, and I think you touched on it, right? Is that if we're not already doing these things throughout the year, if we're not already celebrating all people throughout the year, so whether white, Black, Asian, Latino, what have you, that it becomes awkward then at the month that is meant specifically to celebrate uniquely that individuals of that ethnicity or that race, right? And because of that, it's a problem. The problem isn't if you are behaving in such a way that you're functioning as an organization, as a company, as a church, whatever it might be, in a manner that celebrates all of these different perspectives and views and races and genders, et cetera, that when it comes to the month then to celebrate or focus uniquely on a certain demographic, it's not performative, it's not tokenizing, it's not a problem. The problem is that all of a sudden you go, oh my gosh, it's Black History Month. We should probably have a Black person on AJFF, which is not how this happened. But that becomes the danger, right? Is that instead of behaving and living out in a certain way all year round, it becomes, oh crap, we didn't think about this, and we should probably say something so that way we look as though we're mindful of such things.
Yeah, I think when I'm listening and I'm like, James Baldwin said he had to leave the church to preach the gospel.
Yeah.
I think part of the gospel includes a commitment to truth telling, and that has direct implications to our daily lives. And that has direct impact to how we think about the injustices that are in our immediate communities, and that's what's important to focus on. And so I say that to say ways to move towards an authentic, meaningful relationship with a diverse community wherever you may live is about proximity, and that's not anything unique that I'm saying. We could quickly point to Brian Stevenson in his text "Just Mercy" and his extraordinary work at the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. But proximity is important, and I think to think about 12 months in 1 year, right? And then 1 month is dedicated to African American history. Well, that's gonna kind of shock the way we think about proximity.
Right.
In a way, well, this is kind of like an isolated thing. But we got to move beyond that. We got to move beyond that. We can celebrate Black History Month, but then we need to take that into, again, one example I shared was our public schools. African American history remains extraordinarily underrepresented in public schools across the United States. And again, I previously shared that I believe there's a commitment to truth telling, with the gospel. And so if we want to think about moving away from a performative sort of whatever posture. Let's move outside of just the church, and let's think about what's going on in our immediate community. And again, look no further than the clear under preservation of African American history and the underrepresentation of Black history in our public school systems.
Yes. We have a question here, if you don't mind. So the question reads, a preacher once said, when the church is silent, people die. What'll it take for church to have earthquake moment that'll shatter the tectonic plates they've been built on and actually save lives?
What do you think, Don?
You know, I imagine to some degree people are absolutely tired of hearing me say this. It is the transformation of the Bible moving from a spiritual and a spirituality to a physical and physicality. It is not until we read salvation as safety and liberation that we will actually do any changes. I think that to me is the key. Until the pastor stands in the pulpit and says salvation is about the safety and the well-being and the healthiness of your neighbor. And this comes into your proximity statement, right? And if you are not in proximity to people who are marginalized, then you are living in the wrong spaces, because then you are propping up the empire, you are propping up the oppressor, you are propping up the things that allow the contribution, the systemic oppression of individuals. And that is not the space in which, if you are a follower of the gospel, that you are supposed to be. You are called to be in the center of spaces in which safety is the most needed and required resource. And God has called the faithful to be those things. And so for me, until the church begins to move away from salvation being a prayer that you say about a personal destination post-life, it's not going to change. You can stand up front and quote MLK all you want, but we all know that most white churches only quote the MLK passages that reduce the blackness of our people of color in our communities. We don't like to quote the passages that called out the white pastoral leaders of their time, of MLK's time that he was confronting. We just like to quote things that seem to reduce the focus on color and race.
And again, this is what, earlier thinking about, and Google it, right? Google Operation Breadbasket. This is an example of a reverend, a United States African American citizen who was able to do what we need to be seeing more of.
Yeah, he made it physical.
Right.
It was a physical
That's
call,
exactly right.
not a spiritual call. It was a physical
Right.
call.
Right. Right. And I think but that also has real implications of, first and foremost, personal safety, privilege, and power. And that's not said abstractly. This is not some theoretical absence that you experience like intellectually. This will require to really re-examine what you're willing to do to sort of stand alongside people
Yes.
who are marginalized and oppressed. And I think we saw in the civil rights movement what that can look like.
Yes.
But we cannot ignore that Dr. King was clearly connected and committed and saw no distinction between the social and the theological. And there's no reason he should, because and Don, right, we can quickly just point to Torah and we can quickly just point to the story of Exodus. This is the foundation of liberation theology.
Yes.
Moses did not just sort of pray and wishful thinking and then things were good as we sat and thought about them. This was a material, economic, political, according to the story, economic, political, and of course spiritual liberation. And that is the model for Christianity to look to and go,
Yeah.
well, how do we apply our faith? Well, look to the story of Exodus, look to the leadership of Moses, and examine what was happening. And so I think to the question that was being asked, it's going to require us to turn and look to these stories and to learn them, and then to see how these stories connect with stories today and what our role is in those stories today. I
Yep.
think that's going to be really important. And I will say that's the kick. That's a challenge to power. That's a challenge to serious power. That's a challenge to see. And we can talk about the power of pulpit space and representation in pulpit space and race and the intersections of identities, but we're also talking about nations that are identified as, not officially, of course, in some cases, but Christian nations, and some of which are the most powerful in the world, right? So
Yep.
I think we're going to have to really, ask those questions and be willing to step outside of our comfort zones.
A couple quick comments here. Uh, Tana says, I was just talking about this with a friend today. We concluded that something would have to happen that affects middle-class, white, heterosexual people very harshly. It's not personal enough yet.
One way to make it personal, again, the economic component is extraordinarily important because
Yes.
people are oppressed racially, and
Money
they're oppressed in
talks.
all absolutely, and people are oppressed in all kinds of ways. And because we're talking about race, I'm centering race right now. But to think about economic oppression and to think about economic disenfranchisement, this is something that all races do experience. And I think that is where we can see a lot of power among classes, is to recognize that shared class struggle and the distinctions of race and how race does impact class struggle. But clearly, a lot of people are poor and hungry. A lot of
Yeah.
people of all races are poor and hungry. And so I think those are important connections that we can build solidarity around.
Let me read you another comment from the person that originally asked the question. Celebrating Black History Month when it's not inherently embedded in your organizational DNA is tokenizing as celebrating one's birthday when you don't live life but just exist. So yeah, I think that there's so much that is dangerous when it comes to marketing ploys, right? Whether it's a company trying to convince people that they're green, or trying to convince people that they support the LGBTQ community, or that they are defenders of Black and Latino, Black and brown bodies, and that really at the end of the day, they will only say those things if they imagine they will prosper from them. And this is where it gets gross, as well as the
I,
church.
I think that I think that's something we have to be always on the watch for, and I think that's honest. I think that social justice movements and issues also generate social currency.
Mm-hmm.
And you look no further than to the example of the commodification of Black Lives Matter, which started as one thing and clearly has sort of transformed into this whole other thing, one of which is a brand that has really nothing to do at all
Right.
with some of that original movement work. I'll never forget, I'm a gamer, right? I play video games a lot with my friends. And I remember logging on at that time to playing Call of Duty. Terrible game. Don't play it. I don't play it anymore. But log on to Call of Duty, and there's a Black Lives Matter sort of logo right in the loading screen to this video game. There's no reason that that should be there. Nonetheless, it was there. And we talk
Right.
about the branding of social movements, right? I think we do. We have to be very aware of that. Absolutely.
So what do you think is the right thing for companies or organizations to, and churches for that matter, to be doing, especially if they have not made it part, as Poker Stiff mentioned, part of the organizational DNA? It's not part of the organizational DNA. Should they just remain silent during February? Should they post a comment? Like what do you think? And as as I think should be understood. This is your opinion. This is not you speaking for the Black
Right. Yeah, yeah,
community.
yeah, yeah.
So, what do you think is what needs to happen?
Again, I think that it depends on the company or the business. Is my first response would say. I think mission alignment is important, and I think that if you are a business or a company whose mission has nothing to do with African American history, right? It would make sense to me why throughout the calendar year you're not actively pursuing the promotion of African American history, which then in turn would make sense to me why during the month of Black History Month you might do that. Okay. And I think challenging and again interrogating that will help us better, I hope will help us better see more of the diversity in what we think about when we think about what is American and what does it mean
Yes.
to be American. Ideally, I would love to see sincere, authentic efforts during Black History Month to like celebrate Black History Month. I think we have to have space for that sincerity to be there. And I think we should acknowledge that. And to what we were just talking about, though, we should also be on the watch for that insincerity. So I think being honest to your mission is really important. But I think Black History Month, I'd love to see more businesses and companies celebrating Black History Month, and I would love to see more of them offering their support and their resources to nonprofits who do the work, throughout the calendar year, because they're going to know sort of how best to impact those resources in ways that
Yep.
do, advance the preservation of Black history.
So, Chris, you and I have a long history of studying together, of wrestling with faith and the Bible and Torah, particularly together. What are some of the things that for you have become kind of cornerstones for you as you kind of have been trying to take what's going on with Christiansburg Institute, which I know when you started there, it looks very different today. How long have you been there now? 5 years, 6 years?
Going on 7. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Going on
Yeah,
7.
yeah. So I know from you and I's conversations that there's some anchor points, and I know you mentioned the Book of Exodus, and I know that has some deep connection to you. But some of the ways that you talk about the space that you're in and the space that the Edgar Long building occupies is really, really powerful to me. And I don't know if you would feel comfortable. I'm kind of putting you on the spot to kind of talk a little bit about that.
No, no, you said the name too. You said Edgar A. Long, and that's a really good place for me to sort of start. Kind of going back to what is the Christiansburg Institute, again, the first high school in Southwest Virginia to educate the formerly enslaved, founded in 1866 in Montgomery County, and lasted a full century here in Southwest Virginia. And so it is immense in its story, and Edgar Long himself is immense in his story and what he represents, because Edgar Allan Long represents the first generation of Black people born free in the United States. So Edgar Long was born to Orange and Lila Long in Tuskegee, Alabama. Of course, his parents were formerly enslaved and were, in fact, emancipated, but their son Edgar was the first generation to be born liberated, to be born free. And so Edgar Long became principal of Christiansburg Institute. And there's a lot we could share about that rich story. But thinking right now about Edgar Long, we know the story of CI was formerly a nearly 200-acre school campus in Montgomery County. And we know it was roughly 15 buildings that constituted this
Wow.
African American secondary school.
That's huge.
It's massive. It's massive. It was very, very large. And of those 15 buildings, the Edgar Long building is one of the last remaining buildings that's standing. And we know that African American history, again, is very underrepresented in terms of historic preservation of African American sites of cultural significance. So to have the Edgar A. Long building standing, not only as a representation of CI's former campus, but also, of course, the story of emancipation in the United States is buried in that name, and it's buried in that standing monument.
Can I ask you a quick question about what you said about the underrepresentation? It seems to me, and I'm no expert, that we are more likely to elevate the history of African American history if it is directly related to slavery,
Mm,
and less likely to celebrate African American history if it is something post slavery, right?
mm,
So, like, abolitionists will celebrate Harriet Tubman, will celebrate some of these things, will celebrate homes or buildings that are part of the Underground Railroad, and some of those will be preserved, and only some, right? There's one just outside of Toledo, actually, in Sylvania, that is
mm.
and that one was interesting. A predominantly white church forced them to move the house off of its own property into a side space because the church bought the land that the building was on.
Right.
So it's interesting to me because though the Christiansburg Institute is very, very much adjacent to emancipation and adjacent to slavery in the South, it still is post that moment. And I wonder if that's part of the reason that it struggles, because it's not the story, it's not the victory story that I think white moderates are okay with. Instead, it's, you
Mhm.
know, part of its history, if I'm correct, Chris, and correct me if I'm wrong, is, the pain of forced desegregation, right? When we think about desegregation, we only, especially as in the white community, only think of that as in positive terms. But Christiansburg Institute is an example of how that had a negative impact on the African American community. They had a thriving, beautiful campus and education facilities, and then we're basically that brought about the demise of the institute. Am I correct on that?
No, that's right. And I think, we have to first recognize kind of what does draw our attention to particular African American histories or stories. I think that's really important. And I think earlier, you were talking about slavery and emancipation, and there's a lot of kind of the white gaze, right? That really
Yes.
really sees that, but then sort of goes blind to like the 1960s. Um,
Yeah.
but if we were to sort of open our eyes and look more there, um, there would be a lot for us to see. There would be a lot for us to see that would better inform how we understand ourselves today and how we got to where we are today. And there seems to be this particular interest in the American public with violent histories and stories of Black people, the very visceral
Mm.
suffering of Black people. And the good brother Ta-Nehisi Coates kind of really was one of the figures who introduced language into discourse about Black bodies, and that's important, and that's very important. But I think the one unintended consequence of that was sort of like this obsession with the physical violence done upon black bodies, and that's we cannot ignore that, and it's of course not what I'm suggesting, but we have to look at less visceral examples, more insidious examples that might not look like violence, that we're accustomed to going, wow, that's extraordinarily violent, but has a very similar outcome. And
Mm.
so I remember maybe 2 or 3 years ago, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the bombing of Black Wall Street. Again, it was prior to 3 years ago, a lot of people were like, I have no idea what that is.
Right.
I talked to all kinds of people when that happened, of all different
So
ages.
for our audience, maybe
Yeah.
you could actually, in case there's someone watching that or listening that also is unfamiliar, if you'd be willing to share.
Yeah, I mean, in summary, there was, and I'm not too well read on the extraordinary history of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But in summary, what we see was there was a thriving Black community that constituted grocery stores and banks and locally owned businesses, um, churches, of course, and schools. And there was an incident where an African American man was accused of some kind of inappropriate interaction with a white woman, which was ridiculous and clearly racist and probably not true. Which we see in history all the time, and we see
Yep.
the outcome of that, and the outcome of that in what's called Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was the actual destruction of the entire community,
Yep.
the
Burnt to the ground.
actual burned to the ground. And only 3 years ago did the American public really seem to have this recognition of that and go, wow, not only did I not know that, but that's wild. And that's wrong. And that attention is important. And I think that does build uh, power because people are better informed. There were people who don't want to be informed, but for those who do want to be informed, this is a good thing. But we also have to see how white supremacy can destroy Black history and destroy Black lives without such visceral examples like we're talking about with Black
Yep.
Wall Street. And I think that's something that's important about the Christiansburg Institute, because we're talking about, again, a nearly 200-acre campus with at least 15 buildings. Earlier, I think I heard you broke out for a moment, but I think earlier you said there was a kitchen facility. Yes, absolutely. There was a hospital on the campus. These buildings were destroyed by wrecking ball and crane. And this nearly 200-acre property, the former campus of the school, was publicly auctioned, and it was largely industrialized and commercialized, and lots of residential was built. And so these are other examples of
Yes.
how race directly impacts how we value our stories. And in the example of Christiansburg Institute, we got a long way to go, and that and
Yeah.
that's not unique just to Christiansburg Institute. This is true for African American history everywhere.
I mean, Christiansburg is not a huge metropolis, and yet I would imagine, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's probably not a 100% saturation. Oh, we lost Chris. Hopefully, he'll be back in just a moment. There we go. Let's see if he tried to come back in. Please, if you have any questions for Chris or any questions on this, please throw them in the chat. We'd love to have those. All right, Chris, sorry about that. So I'm trying to remember.
Metropolis.
Yes, that's not a huge metropolis, but I also imagine it's not a 100% saturation rate of knowledge of CI in Christiansburg, a relatively small town. You could probably find pretty easily people who have never heard or had no knowledge of Christian. Now,
Yep.
obviously, that number is shrinking with the work that you are doing and your team is doing. But I know that being in Blacksburg, which is less than 10 miles away from Christiansburg, we had already moved back to Toledo when this opportunity arose for you, and I had never heard of Christiansburg Institute. And Blacksburg also
Yeah.
is a small town. And so that's an
It,
example of how
yeah.
it's a lot of Black history is just unknown, and yet Christiansburg Institute has had some of the most important names in American history that are African American come through there, or at least have touched it in some way, and yet it's still an unknown entity.
Yeah, part of what we do as a nonprofit is offer internships to local high school students. And 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, at the time, Governor Northam created like the first African American history curriculum that could be introduced into the public school system. And Montgomery County Public Schools had one of their high schools, Christiansburg High School, introduced the first Black history class offered
Wow.
in the public school system. So what we did as a nonprofit, we got to work with that class. We got to figure out if students in that class know about the story of CI, and we got to connect with the teacher and kind of be like, hey, you're right here. And when we say you're right here, the high school itself, Christiansburg High School, is built on the former Christiansburg Institute campus, right? And so when I say there was this 200-acre campus, there was also it being developed when it was sold. And one of the buildings that was built on its former site is Christiansburg High School. So we were able to take one of our interns inside the historic Edgar A. Long building. This was an African-American student. He was a senior at the time. And it was the first time he had ever been in the building. And he walked in and he was like, yo, I had no idea that this building was what it was. We kind of drive by it and we think that's like some like old building, and we had no idea this was like an academic schoolhouse, one of 15 on a former 200-acre campus, of which my high school was currently built on. This was a
Wow.
senior.
Yeah.
This senior, obviously being a senior, this is 4 years at that high school, and this young man had no idea about this story. And that's something that we need to go, wow, that's really sad. And that we
It
need
is
to
sad.
change that, though. How much more then, though? How much more now can we do that we recognize this absence? And so, to your point, there remains a lot of local folks, even, right, who don't know about this tremendous history and this tremendous story. And the truth is, Don, there's no really reason why they should, right, at this point.
Right.
There should be a much larger effort going on for this history to be preserved, and that's okay, right? And so we gotta be able to say that honestly, and then be
Yeah.
like, so what do we do next?
Yeah. Because I think when I think about Christiansburg, the Christiansburg Institute might be the most historically significant individual thing that exists in the city of Christiansburg.
That yeah. I mean, it's a prominent centerpiece of
Yeah,
our shared story in the town of
absolutely.
Christiansburg. Being mindful too that the town of Christiansburg is the county seat of Montgomery County. And
Yeah.
so here you have this historic African American secondary school in the county seat. So, but again, why is it though, Don, right? Why is it though that isn't how we understand it, right? Why is
Yeah.
it though that knowing this, there's still that lack?
Yeah. Quick comment here from Tana saying, part of me wonders if it's easier to talk about horrors and what feels like extreme times because it's easier to think, well, it's not that bad anymore.
Mm.
And then it allows whiteness in many ways to be like, I can acknowledge that happened and maintain a position that says that I was not complicit in it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The danger becomes when we move further and further away from these extremes and these violent moments, and then the complicity gets closer and closer and closer until we can't deny our participation. And so I think, as Tana was kind of getting to, that we prefer to keep them as far away as possible. And I think this is why some of this that has happened, Trayvon Martin, Rice, the list. I mean, it used to be, do you remember, Chris, in Blacksburg, it used to be that we could list the prominent examples. And now it's not even possible. I mean, it would take quite the ability or skill set to remember all the prominent examples now that have happened in the last
Don,
6 to 7 years.
absolutely. And you know what? And again, there's a continuity in history that we have to be mindful of. And there's been a deliberate effort for us to miss that continuity because we could easily go, well, right. Emmett Till, that's a prominent young Black man who was murdered at the hands of white supremacy. Uh, we cannot remain disconnected, right? There are always the names of Black people who have been killed
Yeah.
by state violence, and but we have to be able to see that that continuity. I think that's really, really, really important.
I think this is where James Cone's book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, can be really powerful for the white
Mm,
reader, because what it does is it ties the cross to a lynching tree. I mean, it's right there in the title, right? And by making them the same thing, that Jesus found himself as an enemy of the white state, Rome, and therefore ended up murdered, and done in a celebratory fashion, done as a spectacle for all to come and see, done as a manner to dehumanize, belittle, mock, and reduce his humanity. And when Cone does that in the book, I think it becomes inescapable for at least a conscientious white reader of that book to get away from it. You just can't. You can't escape then that connection. And then you can't escape. And I wonder how much what a second or third edition would look like with all of these more
mm,
recent heinous crimes that have happened. If what he may have added to that story, to that book, and how it continues. And now it wasn't just the cross, it wasn't just the lynching tree, but now
mm.
it's dead black and brown bodies in the middle of our streets, because of a perceived slight to common decency.
I think the imagery and to also, so the imagery of a lynching tree, right? And the imagery of a crucifix, right? There's clear similarities there. And thinking about Rome in the first century being an extraordinary, arguably the most oppressive force to Jewish people at that time in the first century.
Yeah.
Um, and so for an African American pastor, theologian to see that connection and go, wow, what is the state power where I am that is doing this to my people? And to make that connection is really important. Again, to reference Ta-Nehisi Coates, it's so important in one of his books, and forgive me, I don't recall the exact book, but he writes that we can't forget that racism is first visceral. There's a lot of sociology around racism that's really important. There's a lot of phrasing and terminology that's really important, and some of it's not, but some of it's really important. But his point was we can't forget that it's first visceral. I think he writes that it breaks bones and shatters teeth and punctures lungs. And I think that's part of what is so shocking about the connection that Cone makes is you can't ignore that bodily violence. And then from there, you start to ask those theological questions and what that means today.
So, Chris, what would you what books or what resources would you recommend for folks who don't want to any longer participate in this on the fringe of okay, I recognize that there's a problem, and I will change my Facebook profile picture to all black, and I'll put a BLM frame around my picture. But now going, maybe that wasn't as productive as I thought. Maybe that's not as valuable as I had hoped. And to move away from the keyboard and into the streets, what types of things, books, resources, other things would you recommend for folks to start taking some of those next steps?
Yeah, like, well, we would both obviously go, hey, read The Cross and the Lynching Tree.
Oh man.
That's gonna be important. Um, Pedagogy of the Oppressed
Yeah.
is
Free
also
air.
another
Yeah.
very important book. Parts of it are dense, but working through it, I think, is important because it will help you see that there's other ways of learning and doing, that are not just kind of what we've been seeing here in the West. I'd also
And
talk
that's an old
about.
book.
Go
Pedagogy of
ahead.
the Oppressed has been around for a long time. I don't know the exact
Mhm,
publish date, but
mhm,
it's been around
mhm.
for a long time.
It has, it has. And We Make the Road by Walking is also another really awesome book, that is also Paulo Freire. I may be pronouncing his name incorrectly, but that's
That's how
him
I
in
pronounce it. So
dialogue. We'll go with it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's him in dialogue with Miles Horton, who was the founder of the Highlander Center in Tennessee. And that's a deep, rich.
I so apologize to our folks that we keep having some problems. My internet is not happy this evening. Hopefully, Chris will be back on in just a second. Here we go. Chris, I am so sorry that my internet is flaking out on us and this keeps happening. So you
No problem,
said
no problem.
Miles Horton conversation.
We Make the Road by Walking. Yes, yes, yes. Read that book. That's an important book. Um, I'm reading a book right now, written by W.B. Du Bois about Reconstruction. It's a lengthy title that I won't be able to fully say right now, but
But
it's
anything by
WB. Yeah,
W.E.B.
yeah, yeah. And that text in particular, because he really does examine the Reconstruction South and breaks
Okay.
it down. And it's a lot of what we don't ever know about. So I would highly, highly recommend that.
Amanda says she thinks the book you are referencing by Coates is
It
Between
is,
the
yep.
World and Me.
Yeah, yeah. And so to Amanda's thing, right? So that book was written, Ta-Nehisi Coates, to his son, like a letter, a father to a son, a black, particularly specifically a black father to a black son,
Yeah.
and preparing their son for the world. And so, powerful text.
So we're about 10 after 9. The next question I want to ask you is how can folks that are hearing you, watching this, listening, whatever, Christiansburg Institute is such a worthwhile space to spend some time, to spend some money, and to consider in your
Yeah.
charitable processes. So, what are some ways that folks can get involved, find you, connect with you?
Absolutely. Well, we're located in Montgomery County, right here in Southwest Virginia, in the town of Christiansburg. So we've got all kinds of ways for local folks to get involved, but also ways for people who are not local to support our work. People who are not local right now, I mean, we have two bills introduced into the state budget to support the preservation of the Edgar A. Long building. So supporting that effort would look like sharing our social media posts and talking to any friends or family that you might have in the area of Virginia to call their local delegates and ask them to support for this bill. We also are in Black History Month, so we've got a lot happening this month in particular. We are launching our new African American History Tour, which is a driving tour that will be available to the public so people can check out local sites. And then our Facebook and Instagram, we're posting more videos about what it looks like to preserve African American history, what it really kind of takes on a grassroots level to do that. Become knowledgeable, please. Learn the story of the Christiansburg Institute. That's one of the best things you can do right now for us, is to learn the story and to share that story broadly.
Yes. Also, Tana said that Freire's book was published
1970.
53 years ago. I knew it was old. I did not think it was older than I am. But 53 years
I came
ago.
in. I came in 19 years after that.
Yeah, listen, youngin. So, Chris, I do want to make sure before we wrap up tonight that you and I acknowledge a mutual friend of ours, brother Efren Alicia. I'm going to
Mm.
get a little emotional. We just found out passed away yesterday, I believe. He was a pastor in New York City. Just a solid human being. I think he was my age or a little bit younger. So anyhow, just keep his family in your prayers. Think about him and his community. It's tough. He's a church planter. It's tough when the founding pastor of a small church plant, suddenly there's a tragedy like this. So just keep him in your prayers. So I just wanted to make sure that we mentioned Brother E tonight. So Chris, we have about, well, as much time as you want, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, or 15 minutes. So not as much time as you want. In 16 minutes, we're done.
All night.
And then we do not know.
All night. You gotta listen to me talk all night.
I am old. So you can talk and I'll just go to bed because that's what I need to do soon. But what are some other things that you just like when I think about you go far beyond Christiansburg Institute. You're probably the smartest person I know. You're one of the most creative, brilliant thinkers I've ever met. And so what are some other ways people can engage with you and your ideas, your thinking, and the stuff that you're working on?
Well, again, you honor me. Thank you, Don. You know, I'm really committed to the work we do at the Christiansburg Institute. It's hard for me right now to think outside of, what I'm passionate about, because passion can take you a lot of places, and we have limited time and we have limited energy. And so right now, man, I mean, like people can engage with me by hitting me up and being like, "Hey, I want to engage with you." No, no, no. I've always been motivated by justice work, right? And I didn't know what that meant. I had no idea what that meant initially. And I came up thinking that all justice was achieved. The civil rights movement was an example of that.
It
Dr.
was a
King died.
success.
Right, right. Dr. King died for us. There's no one else needs to die. This is a similar story we've been told. And I kind of accepted that, but this is not the case. This is not the case. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think my witness to that has been being able to ask questions and being willing to fail. That's so important. You have to be willing to fail, and you have to be willing to accept failure, and then accept what that means. And you can choose to stay in that failure, and I am there sometimes, and sometimes longer than others. But what has been key for me is to be able to stay curious, and I think that's a process, and that's going to look like a lot of different things for a lot of people. I thought I wanted to be a Marine. I thought I wanted to be a police officer. There's people who know me now who would say I would not think Chris Sanchez would want to be those things, and there's nothing inherently wrong with those things. But obviously, it took me time to really work through, well, what is justice work? What does that mean for me in my life? And moving from there, I thought I'm about to be a pastor. That's where you get the work done. That's where justice can be realized, and that is one place too. But right now I'm the executive director of a nonprofit, and I'm like, wow, there's a lot of justice work that has to get done in preserving stories of our ancestors. And I've just been able to be comfortable in that challenge, and have strong mentors around me that challenge me and encourage me to keep asking questions.
Awesome. Well, Chris, is there any last things that you just want to share with our audience, challenge us with, tell us to consider? No pressure if you don't have anything. I feel like I've put like 4 things on you unexpectedly
No,
here at the end.
no, not at all. No, I mean, hey, I can't say it enough. We got to be willing to re-examine our power and what that means for us individually, and what that means systemically. There's a lot of language around power, and individual power, and systemic power. And I think we have to be able to recognize both of those things and what that means for you, because power is at the center of everything. The power to tell the story, the power to tell the narrative is something that we have to be willing to challenge. So I would ask people, just leave people with that, right? Let's all get a little comfortable getting uncomfortable.
Yeah. What was the African proverb that you posted probably the last time I was on social media, which was like about a month or so ago, about the lion will tell the story?
Yeah, yo, that was so really quickly to shout out where I had seen that originally was not in school. I was at a museum in Montgomery, Alabama, the Legacy Museum, which documents kind of the story of slavery to mass incarceration. And there's this wall in the museum with this proverb. I'm paraphrasing, but I believe it is the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter until the lions have their own historian, I believe.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Um, yeah, and that translates into who has the power to tell the story, and that's something that requires you to really challenge,
Yep. Well, Chris, I am so grateful for your friendship, for you being willing to come on and the show tonight. I hope this is not the last time. I hope
Not at all.
this happens more often. I know you're a busy person, so the fact that you took time out of your life to do this means the world to me. I'm so grateful for you, Chris. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to folks who have been asking questions and posting comments. We really appreciate it. Encourage you guys to check out Christiansburg Institute if you're looking for places to give, to help provide more truth telling and more honest history. Christiansburg Institute is a great space to do that. So we'll give Chris a second to see if he's able to log back in. This has been terrible. I feel so horrible that it keeps booting him. We'll give it a moment and see if he's able to. If not, we'll end here tonight. But all right, folks. Well, I don't see Chris coming back in. I apologize. I'm so embarrassed right now that that kept happening. But I hope you guys all have a beautiful night. This was really powerful and meaningful. And yeah, take care. And hopefully we'll see you guys Monday.